right, well, we'll get going. Hi, everyone. I'm Ward Lunger, and I'm one of the owners of the camera company. And I'd just like to thank you for attending our seminar this afternoon. It's kind of weird. 2 weeks ago, I'd never even heard of Zoom, and now we're having these seminars almost every day during the week. I'd also like to thank Erica from Tamron for putting together the content, and I'm sure we're all going to learn a lot about night photography. One thing I did want to mention is we do have a promotion running on Tamron lenses right now where you can get a free ProMaster HGX circular polarizing filter with certain lenses, and that's up to a $200 value. If you're interested, you can go to our website at cameracompany.com, and there'll be a lot of information on that promotion there. The other thing I'd like to mention is at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat bubble. And if you click on that, it'll open up a chat box. This is how you can ask questions during the presentation. We probably won't get to everyone's questions during the presentation, but at the end, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So that's enough for me. I'll turn it over to you, Erica.
Yes. All right. I'm going to move up my screen here. And Ward, the only thing I'm going to need you to do is just tell me if you can see my shared screen. Can you see my presentation?
I can. Looks awesome. Nice photo, by the way.
That one I particularly can't take credit for. That one is Ken Hubbard, the boss of this whole thing. But the rest of them, yes, the majority of them are my images. So thank you.
Very nice.
Great. Okay, guys. Well, I'll get started here. My name is Erica Robinson, and I am a tech rep with Tamron USA. Thank you so much for being here, first of all. That means you are doing your best at this newfound social distancing thing. So thank you for not only social distancing, but spending some time here with me on the internet, coming to you live from my good old living room in San Diego, California. Usually I like to interact with my classes here, but I'm not going to be able to really hear all of you, of course. But as Ward mentioned, there is that chat box down at the bottom. So if you have questions, please feel free to throw your questions down in there. I'll do my best to get to all of them, mostly towards the end of the presentation, just so we don't have to go back and forth too many times. But on that, let's get right into it. So today, we're going to be talking about night photography. Because there's so much to talk about in night photography. When the sun goes down, our cameras don't have to go off. The colors get more enhanced as our sun goes down. We have those beautiful sunsets. Cityscapes offer a completely different feel during the evenings than they do during the day. And of course, dark nights, we can offer those epic long exposures. So there is really a lot to think about. But during this presentation, if you take away one thing in particular, I just hope that you are inspired, that you're inspired to photograph more, that when we are able to do so and when we are able to get out there to be photographing as much as we can, the better we know our tool and the more we know where we are and what we're photographing, the better images we're going to take. So be inspired. So we are going to move on to the next here. First off, we need to, like I said, know our tool. The better we know our equipment, the better images we're going to take. Bottom line, regardless of whether you're a Nikon shooter, a Sony shooter, a Canon shooter, what lenses you're using, you need to know your tool. Every camera out there is going to, if you're using your DSLR, is going to have your MASP. Your manual, aperture priority, shutter priority, and program. So get to know your camera. The biggest tip specifically for photographing at night, if you haven't gotten really to play too much around with your camera, photograph inside in a dark room. Take out your camera and really you figure out where all of those buttons are while you are in a dark room, and your situation is easy for you to turn on and off the light so you can learn your camera before getting out into those real life situations. So first tip number one. We also need to know our settings. So our shutters, our aperture priority, or excuse me, our shutter, our aperture, our ISOs, we still need all three of those things, regardless of whether we are shooting day photography or night photography. So we can't just let all three of those things out the window. Those are going to be your three most important pieces to creating your exposure. So we're going to start from the beginning and kind of run through those quickly and do the basics of exposure before we get into some of the other kind of fun night stuff. So starting with aperture. Your aperture does two very important things. One, lets in your light, right? So whether we are stopping down, if we're stopping down, we are letting less light in. We are looking at, f11, f16, literally a hole inside of your lens that you determine how much light you are letting in or not letting in. When we are down at f4, f2, f2.8, f2, f1.4, we are opening up our lens, letting up a whole lot more light into that lens, right? So an example here, when we are out at night and need to have more information, more light coming into our sensor, opening up our lens and letting more light in is going to be incredibly important. The other thing that our aperture does is that chooses our depth of field. So whether we are wanting to see our entire background, we're wanting to see more of our background, we're up at f11, f16, and if we are interested in creating a more narrow, shallow depth of field, we are closer down to the 5.6, f4, f2.8. Then that, of course, also has to do with you as the photographer, the distance between you, your subject, and your subject to your background. And all of those things we have to keep in mind, right? So moving on to our shutter speed here. Shutter speed also does very important things, including letting light into our camera, into our sensor. But the very first question that we have to ask ourselves with shutter speed is if we want to stop motion or if we want to see motion, right? So if we want to stop motion, in this first example here, if we want to stop motion, I need that faster shutter speed. This image in particular was shot at about a 2,000th of a second to make sure that I could stop that fishing line. Because if I shot, let's say for an example, just for extreme purposes, at a whole second, right? If I shot at a whole second, I probably wouldn't have even seen that line. His arm would have been moving. I really wouldn't have had much information there to be able to tell. I would not have stopped that line. But we know then on the opposite side of things, if we want to show our motion, having a slower shutter speed is going to allow that information to pass through our frame so that we can see it a bit more. So slower shutter speeds, we will be able to see that information more. The other thing that our shutter is going to do is, just like our aperture, allow light into our camera. So the longer we have our shutter open, the more light we're going to be able to let into our sensor. So I have a little string of images here that I'm going to show you starting at f16. This was outside set up at a tripod so that you can kind of see how much light was being let in over a good amount of time. So take a look here. As I'm going through, I'm going to move my there we go. All right, so starting back here at 1.6 seconds, moving forward to 13 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 seconds, all the way here to 20 seconds, right? So there's a major difference going from 1.6 seconds to 20 seconds. We're able to let a lot more light into our frame. This does, of course, involve having a tripod, which is something we're going to talk about pretty soon, but I'm not going to get into that just yet. So moving on to last but not least, the piece of our equation for our ISOs, right? If any of us have shot film, our ISO has not changed since the film days. The only difference is that we're physically changing it with a dial inside of our camera instead of actually changing out the roll of film, right? So we don't have to take in and out that roll of film anymore. We can change it every image that we want just with the click of a button. And ISOs now, ISOs can range anywhere from as low as about 50 ISO up to, man, a bazillion ISO basically. There are a lot of Sony cameras out there that can let in a whole ton of light to their sensor. Really what we're doing is we're making our sensor more or less sensitive to light, okay? So if we are out in the middle of the day, right? We don't need a whole lot of extra light to be hitting our sensor. If we put too much, we're gonna overexpose it. So trying to keep as low as possible, down at about 100 ISO, maybe 200 or 400 ISO during the day. That way we're not adding too much additional light. And then as we get later in the afternoon, as that blue hour comes in, we might need closer to 800 ISO. Again, just letting more light to our sensor. And then 3200 ISO, and so on, depending on, again, how much light we really need to let into that sensor. A lot of times your ISO is the kind of last piece of the puzzle that we're thinking about, but it's just as important, it's just as crucial as our aperture and our shutter speeds. We need all three of those parts in order to fit this proper equation to make the image that we want to create. Okay, so I'm going to move into composition and technique. So now that we have kind of the technical aspect of it, we're going to talk more about creating our image and talking about composition, because this is where we can be our own unique artist. We can be the creative part of this. So this is where we can create our images that are unique to us. Thinking about our focal point, our leading lines, perspective angles, and so on. All of these pieces kind of acting like almost like puzzle pieces to pulling up the composition of the picture that we want to take, right? So we're going to go through each of them here, starting with focal point. What is our focal point really? Our focal point is the piece of the image that we are telling our viewer to look at. And we are controlling this as the photographer, we're controlling this as the artist, but we need to make sure that we have one designated spot for our viewer's eye to go to, that our viewer knows where to look, right? And how do they do that? They do that with leading lines. So leading lines are the next piece of the puzzle to that structure, to being able to physically lead our viewer's eye into the focal point of our frame. We're telling them exactly where we want to look. Now where they want to look. Now, our leading lines can be man-made. Yes, in this sense, they're man-made. They can be done with motion. They can be done with light. Leading lines can be made up of all different pieces. And there can also be more than one. There's nothing saying that you can't have more than one leading line in your frame, as long as they are all leading your viewer's eye exactly where you want them to go in that focal point. Okay? Talking about perspective and angles. So a lot of times people hate when I tell them this, but sometimes you have to lay on the ground or stand on a rock or get in some crazy position to actually get the photo that you want to take. But it gives your viewer a completely different view instead of just standing there, taking a quick picture and turning around and walking away. Right? You getting low to the ground, you moving to one side, nothing else matters outside of that frame. It's just what's in your frame. So thinking about your perspective is going to change what your viewer sees. Now, knowing your tool, knowing what lenses you're using, what cameras you're using, can really help you when it comes to your perspective and understanding the different angles that you are looking at. So I have three images here, this one here, this one here, and this one here, all shot at the same location, all shot with the same lens, my 15 to 30 millimeter 2.8 lens. But because I know that lens is incredibly wide, I know that I can start back here at the beginning, taking the image that we all take out there at the St. Louis Arch, getting the arch and the city in the background. But knowing as wide as that lens is, I can get closer and even closer to my subject to create different images instead of just taking that one standard image and not really doing anything else with it. Try different perspectives and different angles with your lens. Okay. Now I see I have a couple of questions up here, so I might jump into those real quick just to, oh, no, not yet. Okay. All right, well, so moving on to next, another piece to that puzzle is thinking about our rule of thirds, okay? I know that all of you have heard of your rule of thirds, and really what that rule says is that you don't want your subject, you don't want anything directly in the center of your frame, right? Now, I consider rules in photography more like guidelines. They're not hard set and fast rules by any means, but in a lot of cases, your rule of thirds is going to help you with your composition, not have something so straightforward, right? So that rule of thirds breaks down your image into a grid. Your top third, your middle third, your bottom third, your left, your middle, and your right, right? And what it says is on those grid points, that's where you generally want to put your subject so that it's not dead center. So this is just a quick example here, having your subject off to the side. So your viewer kind of has to be forced to look at a different angle inside of your frame instead of having it right in the middle, okay? All right. Now, one of the last pieces to that puzzle that I think that gets forgotten probably the most when we're taking images out there, again, regardless of day or night, um, but scale. Scale is an incredibly important piece to this puzzle because when we're out there photographing, we bring these images home, the people that we show these images to, they weren't there, right? They couldn't smell the smells, feel the feels, see how big or how small something was. So we need to, as the artist, as the photographer, we need to give them some direction, right? So usually if I was to interact with you guys, this is the time where I'll make you guess whether or not this is a big or small kind of setup here situation, because it could be either, right? So if you take a look at the next frame here, indeed, it is a huge situation, right? So if we put something in our frame that our brain, as human beings, naturally knows how big or how small that is, if we're doing macro photography, there's an ant, whatever it is, if we're outside and we have cars, we have plants, we have trees, structures that our brains just know the size of, it helps our viewer understand measurement a little bit more in our frame. And it doesn't take anything away from the image. It's not like we are hyper focused on that being a human being. It just allows our viewers' brains to understand the situation a little better in our frame. Okay, so don't forget about our scale as well. Okay, so now we're gonna get into some night photography tips, tricks, and techniques, okay? One of the things to think about, of course, before it hits that dark night hour is what time of day or midday, evening, night that we are shooting at, because it's going to make a big difference in our image, okay? We need to think about our white sky, our blue sky, and our black sky, because that is going to change the whole dynamic of our frame. This image here and then the next two images I'll show you are in the exact same spot, just at 3 completely different times of the day. And it changes the image drastically, right? So when we're out there during white sky, there's really just nothing exciting about it. It's just sort of bland. This is a day where there really was just a ton of cloud coverage, so I didn't have any of those big, white, nice, puffy clouds in a blue sky, so it was just kind of a drabby image, right? So then if I go too late, if I'm still hanging around there too late, I have no separation between the buildings, between really much of my foreground and my background. It's just kind of gotten lost. So it's kind of the Goldilocks effect in a sense, where I want to be there right at blue hour. That way during blue hour, I now have that depth from my foreground to my background. I have all that separation, and it's just a much prettier image as far as color goes for our viewer to look at. It's not drab like the white sky. It's not too compressed like the black sky. Fits right in the middle. Blue sky gives us all of that more quality to our image. Okay, so that's your tip number 1. Now that we've talked about our technical aspect, we talked about building the composition of our image, right? Think about how long our shutter is going to be open for. So when we were talking about shutter speed back at the beginning, we talked about the ability that our shutter has when it comes to not only letting a whole ton of light in, but talking about motion too. So if we are out there in situations where there's a lot of people walking around, if anybody has been to the Bean out in Chicago, you know that there is just hundreds of people all the time. You'll never get that image where there's just no one there. So one of the ways to do that, if you want no one in your image, is to leave our shutter open for a longer period of time. The longer our shutter is open, the more people are just going to stroll right through, and we're not going to see them in our frame. The only things that we will see are the things that are staple right there and not going anywhere. So this shot here was shot at 15 seconds. I still have one person right in the middle there, but he really didn't move. He was also taking pictures just on the other side, so he was waiting for his frame to be done. I actually thought it would be nice to keep him in there just as a kind of, again, with that scale, just as a measure to show how big something actually was. And I do have someone off to the right a bit ghosted out, but everybody else that was walking through, I'd say there was a good maybe 15 or 20 other people out there. And because they were all walking around at a good pace, you can't see any of them, okay? So knowing that our shutter can do that, we can then take that even further into our night sky photography. So this is where I definitely want to bring up making sure that we talk about both our shutter and the use of a tripod. I don't care if you've never had a cup of coffee in your life. I personally don't drink coffee, but still, you can't hand hold for 10 seconds. You can't hand hold for usually even a couple of seconds. You can't hand hold for 30 seconds. You can't hand hold for a minute. It's just not possible. So a tripod, when we are out there doing night photography, is very, very necessary. Specifically, of course, in situations like this, 30 seconds, you're not going to be able to hand hold. I've had many people tell me that they can, it's okay. I'll set my camera down on a rock, or I will use the hood of my car, right? And that's okay. You can technically use that as a stabilizer. Yes, you can do that, but then you've lost all composition, all ability to choose the composition that you want, right? So if the frame that I want to take is over there and the rock that I'm using is right over here, that's not really going to help me. So I need to make sure that I have total flexibility, and the only way that I can do that is with the use of a tripod. So when we get into our night stuff here, make sure that that's something that you have on your list to keep with you. I will give you in just a second kind of the general rule for shooting stars night photography. We're going to get into that next. But before we do that, lastly, still going back to that shutter speed ability here and elongating our shutter speed. So we started off with something way back in the beginning that was 1.6 seconds, and you saw how much light that let in. We have images in here that were shot at 15 seconds, where we just did the bean a second ago in Chicago. That was shot at 15 seconds. The image before was shot at 30 seconds, and this image here was shot at 3 minutes. That way I could really not only let in a good amount of light because it was a very dark night, but I could also have that car going right through my frame. So you can see the lights starting from the beginning of where that point is on that rock. That's where he turned the corner driving, all the way up through the edge of my frame. And I judged that just with a couple of cars that went through before him. I sat out there literally with my phone and waited and watched to see how long it would take them to drive through my frame. And I used 3 minutes as the starting point to adjust all of my other pieces, to then adjust my aperture, to adjust my ISO, to adjust the other 2 pieces in that equation that I would need to make sure that 3 minutes was as long as I could take it to get through my frame. Okay. All right, so I have a couple of night sky tips here for you. You're welcome to take a quick picture of your screen if you want, or write all these down. I'll leave it up for a minute here. But I think they are really important parts to touch on when it comes to our night photography, specifically when we are photographing the night sky. If we want to pinpoint those stars, we'll talk about the difference really between pinpointing our stars and getting a little bit of motion in our stars. But all of these pieces here are important for either. So first things first, we want to set our lens to manual focus, okay? We can't focus on a star that far away. So setting our lens into manual focus, and then manually using our LCD screen to zoom in to one of the pinpointed stars that are out there, manually focus on that star, and then gaffer's tape that down so that you don't move it. You just zoom back out on your LCD screen and keep your lens on manual focus. That will allow your lens to not override, so that you have the ability to just shoot the entire time. Next up, always have a shutter release. Tape your shutter release down to the side of your tripod so that it doesn't move around if it's specifically a windy night, so that you're not adding that extra shake to your frame. If you don't have a shutter release, you can of course use your timer in your camera. So set your timer specifically to 2 seconds, so that when you hit your shutter, it gives 2 seconds before it takes the image, and you're not adding extra pressure to your camera. You're not worried about adding that little bit of shake when you actually touch your camera to take the picture. Next, turn off your VC. So a lot of lenses out there, the majority of lenses out there now, especially in Tamron land, have what's called VC, vibration compensation. VC is physically a motor inside of your lens that in handheld situations will allow you to hand hold at lower shutter speeds and still stop the frame. But when we're set up on a tripod, if we leave our VC on, that motor is still working. So it's out there hunting, trying to figure out, oh, I need to try and stop it, I need to try and stop it, and it's going to see the motion. So when we're set up on our tripod, definitely turn your VC off. Next, know what you want to shoot before going out to photograph it. Research as best you can. Be in the right location for where you want to shoot it, because the last thing you want to do is kind of be fumbling around out there and being overwhelmed with everything that's going on, with all the buttons and numbers in your camera, with just the scene itself. Think about it, take your time, and be patient. Patience is not my best skill, so I've definitely had to work on that over the years, but definitely be patient with it because it is a process. Next, have everything you need in a handy pocket. When I go out there, specifically in the national parks and I'm shooting night skies, I have on my cargo pants that have like 16 different pockets in them so that I can have everything handy. The last thing that I want to do is be digging around trying to find something in the dark and fumbling for it. Even if I have a headlamp, turning on and off my headlamp is then a giant pain because then I have to let my eyes adjust and things like that. So making sure I have everything in a handy pocket is really useful. Not to mention, in certain situations, you don't want to leave your bag just lying open out there if there's any sort of weather, or if you're out at Great Sand Dunes National Park and you have a whole ton of sand, you don't want all that in your bag and ruining your equipment. So have everything in a handy pocket. Lastly, talking about white balance, these are some general starting points for your white balance that seem to work quite well in the majority of cameras. There's never an exact equation for every single image. I used to joke with my grandfather because he was an engineer and he wanted that exact equation to everything. And unfortunately, there isn't an exact equation to every situation, but there is, like I said, general guidelines. So these are your general guidelines to thinking about your white balance when you're out there shooting Milky Way, about 3,900 Kelvin, moonlight 3,000 Kelvin, and dark sky can be at either tungsten or about 3,200 Kelvin. Okay. Now, there is also a general rule of thumb for getting those pinpoint stars for photographing the Milky Way. So that rule here, if you want to write it down, is 500 divided by your focal length equals your exposure time. Okay, so if I'm out there with my 15 to 30 millimeter 2.8 lens, and I am super wide at 15, the examples below will show that 500 divided by 15 is about 33 seconds. So your general rule of thumb for photographing the Milky Way in the night sky is written right there at the bottom. Start there, about 30 seconds, 3200 ISO, and f2.8. And what that's doing is f2.8, of course, is letting in a whole ton of light into our camera. Our ISO being about 3200, also making that sensor more sensitive to light. And then 30 seconds, giving all of that light time to get in there, time to get into our frame. And again, that's a general rule of thumb. It's not exact, more because depending on what time of year you're out there, depending on what day of the month you're out there, there may be more light because of moonlight. There may be more light because of city light you have in the background there. So depending on where you are in the world, you're gonna have to adjust that based on the amount of light that's already available to you. Okay? So one of the last things I want to touch upon here with our Milky Way and shooting or specifically with the shooting the Milky Way, is to give it some sort of base, give it some sort of guideline as to what's in the bottom of your frame. Think about your foreground and your background. Just because we're out there photographing the Milky Way and we get that's beautiful, make sure you give it a landing point and give it perspective. Don't forget about all those composition tips that we just talked about, because depending on the time of the year, gives a completely different shape to our Milky Way. In this instance, it's straight across. Other times of the year, it is directional. So we want to make sure that we're giving it some sort of base and landing point to end at, so that it's not simply just the Milky Way. So that when we look up into the sky, we see that whole Milky Way, and that's great. Give it a foreground, give it a background, give it a landing point. Don't forget about your composition. Those things didn't change just because you're photographing the night sky. Okay. So last but not least, when you are out there photographing at night, prep all of the things that you're going to need for your evening. Extra batteries, and if it's an especially cold night, keep those extra batteries in a pocket close to you, whether it's in a pants pocket or a jacket pocket, chest pocket. Make sure that it is close to you, because it will keep the batteries, it'll keep the batteries warm. If the batteries get cold, sometimes they will lose their charge a bit quicker. So always have extra batteries. Extra memory cards. I have definitely been in situations where people have gone out with one 32 gig card or one 64 gig card, and just because they have a huge memory in there, yes, they can take a whole lot of images for that night, but what happens if that card corrupts? If that card corrupts, we've now lost the ability to not only take more pictures, but we don't know if the pictures that we've taken are still there and are still good. So have backup memory cards. Your tripod. We've definitely talked about your tripod in here. Make sure you have that with you, because again, there's no way you can handhold for a couple of seconds. You can't handhold for 30 seconds to shoot the night sky. That is a very important piece to the equation. It's definitely not an accessory anymore in that case. It's a necessity for those situations. A cable release. We talked about having a cable release and the use of them. If you don't have one, remember you can still use your timer, either the 2-second or even the 10-second timer. That way you're not adding extra pressure to taking the actual picture. You're not worried about extra shake in your picture, okay? Bring those extra water and snacks, because you're not going to want to run back to the car and take up that time that you have to photograph. Bring extra things with you. Pack your bag properly. Glow sticks. Glow sticks was actually something I learned a couple of years ago when we were out photographing in the Great Sand Dunes National Park, because when you're out there in the dunes, everything is huge. You start to lose all perspective of your direction back to the car. So especially if you're out there photographing by yourself, lead yourself a little bit of a trail, or put a pack of glow sticks closer to the entrance of where you came from, so you know how to get back there. It's all about preparation. Layers, gloves, warm socks, hat, good sneakers. This may not be something that I have to tell all of you, but it's definitely something that we forget about because we're so busy prepping our camera equipment. But make sure you have enough on you that you are taking care of as well, because the camera's not going to take pictures by itself. It needs you to do that. So take all of those things with you. All right, so that did go by a little quick, but I wanted to make sure that I left enough time for questions and for chatting. This information, this is me. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram as Tamron Tech Erica in both places. Please feel free to ask questions. I'm definitely out there to support you. And now I'm going to turn on our chat here so that we can go through some of those questions. All right, let's see if I can. Okay, some shutter speeds on some of them. Okay, so let's go back through and see if I can pull up some of shutter speeds here. Mr. John, if you're still there, John Seward, can you tell me which images you were talking about for examples on shutter speeds? And I can pull some of them up for you. Hopefully you're still here and you can hear me. All right, we'll give John a minute to answer that. In the meantime, I have another question here. Is there a trick to getting the Milky Way to turn out but still have the foreground, the rocks you have in the picture, or does that get washed out? Okay, so good question. So the question I have here is talking about your foreground when you're photographing the Milky Way, photographing the night sky. Again, it all depends on how much light you already have there. So there will be situations where you're out and you have a good amount of moonlight, so it will light up the foreground automatically for you. The other way you can do it is light painting. So if you, I would suggest bring a flashlight with you. The cleanest light you have, you don't want something that gives off sort of like an orange tone or anything like that, but you can light paint. Now, light painting can get a little tricky because no matter if you think you've painted in the same direction every time or the same amount of time every single time, it will turn out different. So light painting, you definitely have to be patient with it. Sherry, thank you for your question. Actually, it was a really good question. It won't get washed out if you give it the correct amount of light. So it's just going to take trial and error when it comes to how much light you put on your foreground and you put on your subject. But yes, light painting is definitely a good way to do that. So I hope that answered your question, Sherry. What other questions have here? Most examples. Okay, so I have a question here about specific lens range for that. So most of your examples are lenses with the 15 to around the 15 to 70 range. Do you ever use longer lenses for night shots? Awesome question, Brian. So most of the time for my night skies, I'm using something wide. I'm using my 15 to 30 or a 10 to 24 because I want to see my entire frame. I want to see everything in that night sky, right? The other trick to that is that if I use a longer lens, let's say if I use a 24 millimeter or even a 50 millimeter, there's nothing wrong with doing any of that, but you then have to adjust your shutter speed. So that equation only works if we're at wider angles, right? So if I'm at 30 seconds and I am super wide at 15, I'm not gonna see the movement of the stars. But if I get in closer, if I'm at 50 millimeter, I now probably can't go for all 30 seconds because I'm going to start to see that little bit of star trail. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's completely your personal preference as the artist. But my suggestion, if you're doing star trails, is to not just, is to either pinpoint them, right? So do that pinpoint of the stars, or get an entire trail of them through. Get a good amount of that trail. Don't just do a little blip. I know I had a couple of images in there of one, that little 3-minute frame that I had up there was just 3 minutes and you saw a little blip. Sometimes it just honestly looks like a mistake. So I would say choose either pinpoint the stars or get a really long trail. So that's the only reason why I don't tend to use physically longer lenses for my night sky photography. But it's definitely an option. You have the ability to do that. Okay, Greg, can you talk a bit about noise at your higher ISOs? Yes, absolutely. So when we talked about ISO earlier, ISO, as I said, is no different from our film days to our digital days, except we are able to change it picture by picture instead of taking out the roll of film inside of our camera and putting it back in, right? So back in the day when we were shooting film, we had to worry about going up to 1600, going to 3200 and seeing all of that grain, right? Nowadays, our sensors in our camera have come a really, really long way. There are some cameras out there who can shoot, man, at like 1 million ISO and you don't have to worry about seeing that grain, but that grain, that noise is particular per camera. So what I would do is I would suggest to the next time you're out there photographing at night, put your camera to the test. Shoot the exact same scene at multiple different ISOs so that you can see the grain ability or the noise ability that your camera has. Because there are a lot of cameras that when you push up to, when you get to 800 ISO, it struggles. But the majority of cameras out there now at 3200 ISO, at 6400 ISO, even higher, you don't have to worry about that noise as much. So Greg, good question. I hope that answered your question there. Let's see. Okay, another question here from Walt. when shooting northern lights, are the guidelines the same as the Milky Way? So yes, well, yes and no. So again, it depends on how much light you have in your situation. I've been out shooting the northern lights a couple of times, and I have not needed 30 seconds at all. With the good amount of light that's there, I've tended to really only need 10 or 15 seconds, because I also want to stop the movement of those lights. So it depends on the shape you want to make with those lights. The longer that you leave your shutter open, the more movement you're going to see. So in a good amount of them, I was maybe at 10 or 15 seconds because I wanted to stop some of that motion. So the guidelines are similar, but not exact, right? So I think the last time I was out shooting for the northern lights, I was maybe only 10 or 15 seconds, and I was at about 2000 ISO because I had a good amount of light on my foreground as well. So then it's the balance of, well, if I have a good amount of, or if I don't have any light on my foreground, let me just make sure that I'm exposing properly for the northern lights, I'm exposing properly for the main part of my image, and maybe I'm light painting a little bit, or maybe I'm bringing out those shadows later on in post-process, because when you're post-processing, remember that you want to expose for your highlights. No matter what type of picture you're taking, you generally want to expose for your highlights, because your shadows are something you can have the ability to pull back a bit more later on. Highlights are really hard to pull back. So I would strongly suggest to make sure that our highlight is not blown out, and that our shadows are what we're thinking about later on pulling out. So Walt, I hope that answers your question. I'm going to go back through a couple more questions here. Don't forget to, let's see, Delmar, don't forget to get pictures of the clouds under the arch in St. Louis during the day, and especially with the deep blue sky before nightfall. Definitely, I have to make it back there. I definitely have to take some pictures of blue sky there, because the arch is incredible. So yes, thank you for the tip. I appreciate that. Jody, can you recommend any apps to use for night photography? Yeah, there are a couple of them out there. Two that I use are Photo Pills and Sky Guide. Sky Guide is a super easy app to use. When you turn it on, you literally can face it up at the sky and it will tell you exactly what you're looking at. So what I usually suggest to do is to, when you're prepping for your photo shoot, if you've been there before, go out there during the day, find your spot and where you're going to set up based on what you see in the sky in your Sky Guide app. And you can plug in what time and what day you're going to be there. So let's say it's, I don't know, June 15th, you're out there prepping, and you're going to be out there June 16th for your photo shoot. Make sure you plug in June 16th, and you plug in, you know, from 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. You plug in a chunk of time so that you can press play and watch where the Milky Way is going to be at that specific time that you're going to be there. So that way you can prep with Sky Guide. Photo Pills is another incredible app. However, I do definitely suggest doing a bit of research with the app, because it is such a deep program. It has so much information that you can use for sunsets, for sunrises, for your night sky, for different angles. There's so much involved that if you just get out there that night, pull it out and expect to use it, it's going to be pretty tough. There are also multiple people doing webinars right now, so I'm sure you could find somebody doing different webinars on those apps. And there are plenty of people who have done a bunch of YouTube videos on them. So go ahead and just watch a bunch of YouTube videos on them. That will definitely help. So thank you for those questions, Jody. Those are the two apps that I use. That was Sky Guide and Photo Pills. Let's see. Make sure I go over most people's questions here. Okay, I have a question here about shooting RAW versus JPEG. So I generally shoot everything in RAW. However, I have a lot of friends that shoot both RAW and JPEG. You can set your camera to shoot both at the same time for a couple of reasons. One, so that you can get that JPEG quickly and you can view it on your camera and view kind of the output of that. But I specifically shoot in RAW because RAW is going to give me more information on that file to go back in and post later on, to go back in and edit later on. If I shoot in JPEG, JPEG is exclusively a compressed file. So I don't have as much information on that file to be able to edit and to process later. And there's nothing wrong with that if you're just looking to take your images and have them already kind of pre-edited a bit, which in JPEG, it being compressed, it saturates it a little bit more, it gives it a bit more contrast, but that way you have your file one and done. You don't have to worry about it later on. But if you want to do any sort of editing, if you want to do post, I strongly suggest shooting in RAW. Let's see. We talked about light painting. So a software for, let's see, Rick is asking about a software for star trails. Okay, the only app that, or the only processing software that I've used for star trails is Star Stacks. Star Stacks seem to work really well. It's a super simple program, and it will also give you, a couple of filters after that, even so that you can play around with your contrast in the whites and the blacks and the really deep tones that are in there. So you can really push them to be quite extreme. But Star Stacks is the only one I've used. I don't tend to really over edit my images. I kind of want them to be as honest and as real as I can get them. So that's the only Star Trails software that I've used, but it was very easy and it was free. So I definitely suggested it was something to give a try. Let's see. Adrian asking about a shutter release. Can you explain what a shutter release is and where I can purchase? Sure. So a shutter release is either it can be a cable release, which is connected to your camera, or it can be a digital release not connected to your camera, but it allows for you to control the shutter separately, wirelessly, instead of having to push the shutter on your camera. This way, one, it helps eliminate vibration from you actually touching the camera and taking images, and it also can allow you to, in nicer shutter releases, you can control how long you want to leave your shutter open. So instead of having to fumble around with everything on the camera, your shutter release can help you program, let's say I want to be in 3200 ISO, f2.8 for 30 seconds. I can manually control that on my, what's called an intervalometer or shutter release, and choose all of that on there instead of having to fumble with the camera. Where you can purchase from your local camera store. I definitely suggest getting in touch with them. I'm sure they have some. We can probably ask Ward at the end of this. He likely has some in his store as well. They are specific per camera, so we just want to make sure that we get the right one for your camera. Okay. Let's see. Okay, I have one last question here about focusing night photos. Yes, okay. So focusing with night photography. So there's a couple of different ways you can do this. And it does depend on, again, how much light we have in our frame, right? So if we are out in the city and we have a good amount of light, we're set up on our tripod, let's say with this image here, I'll play a picture here. All right, so let's say we're set up in the city, set up on our tripod, and there's a good amount of light, right? I can find a specific part about 3/4 of the way through my frame, through my picture, that I can put my camera on autofocus, move my focus point over, focus on that point, and then turn my autofocus off, putting it on manual focus. So then every picture for the rest of the evening that I'm in that one spot taking all those multiple frames, I am not, I'm not worried about missing my focus. I'm not worried about any shutter movement. I'm not worried about missing my focus. The other way, let's say we're out photographing the night sky, it's a whole lot harder to focus on the night sky. Usually it's not possible, right? So what I would suggest is to turn your lens into manual focus, use your LCD screen and turn on your live view, physically zoom in to the brightest star in your frame. You're gonna have to zoom in a whole lot of times. Again, it's a patience game. We wanna make sure that we're taking our time with this, but you zoom into the brightest star you can find with your LCD screen, manually focus with your lens, and now zoom back out on your LCD screen, and it will stay in that. As long as you're not going anywhere, you're not moving, it will stay focused the entire time throughout the rest of your pictures, and you won't have to worry about auto-focusing and your image getting overridden by autofocus. Oh, good. Okay, Adrian, that answered your question. Okay, so I'm going to pull back in Ward here so that he can answer a couple of questions. I see we have some questions for two. All right, Ward, can you hear us okay?
I can. Thanks, Erica. What a great session you did there. I learned a lot.
Good, thank you, thank you. I wish I could actually talk to all of you in person, but yes, thank you for that. Thanks for being here. So I know we had a couple of questions about shutter releases and things like that. Looks like there was some questions for you. So if you want to answer those, and then we can bring Steve in, because I think Steve had some things he wanted to say about rebates and such.
Yeah, so our store's not open, but we do have people at the store, myself and Tim Erickson, when he's another one of the owners. He's super knowledgeable. So if you have any questions during the day, we've been there from like 10 to 4, 10 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon. Just give us a call and Tim can help you out, whether we do a transaction over the phone or on the website or a combination of both. But yeah, don't hesitate to give us a call. We get kind of lonely and it's really kind of nice to have somebody to talk to be honest with you.
All right, let's see if I can also pull in Steve.
Hello. There he is.
Steve, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, thanks. So I know you had a couple of things that you wanted to mention as well regarding rebates and things that are available for Tamron. So take it away, friend.
Yeah, I just wanted to, first of all, I wanted to thank the camera company for hosting this seminar. Erica always does a good job on her seminars, and I'm sure everybody learned a lot. If there was something that you had questions about, as Ward said, give them a call about any questions or pricing on any lenses, availability. But there is some special rebates that just started on on March 30th that run through May 3rd. And they're going to be anywhere from about $50 up to $200 depending on the lens. So those are instant savings. When you get those from the camera company, they'll automatically take those amounts off. At this time, more than ever, please support your local camera dealers. Guys like the camera company that are making the effort to stay in touch with their customers and teach you and help you out in any way. If there is a need, please get in touch with them and they'll help you out.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate that. I just had one other thing I'd like to add, and that's that we are recording this session and it will be available for viewing on our website starting tomorrow. If you go to our class page, you'll see a link to it.
Good, that's great. I'll share that as well. So, well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you everybody for supporting Tamron. Thank you for social distancing and hanging out in my living room with me. You guys have my information that was posted at the end of the video as well. So, so please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, if you need anything. And I hope to catch you guys all on the road sometime soon. All right. Thank you so much, Ward. Have a good day.
Thanks, Erica. You too.
Bye, everybody.
All right, bye.